everybody. Welcome. Come on in. Come on in. So happy to have you here today. We are going to be covering settings today. I think it just started. We are going to be covering settings today. So I'm so happy to have you here because this is a very interesting and helpful topic because we all know that settings matter, but we so quickly will want to be worried about maybe dipping into it too much or describing every last little detail and boring the audience. But on the other hand, we certainly don't want to have a white room with characters in the foreground and a bland background, and we want it to work for us. So how do you balance these elements? How do you keep the audience's interest? How do you intertwine setting? We're going to cover all of that. Maybe not in complete detail because I only got about an hour, but we're going to do our best. So welcome, everybody. As I go through this, though, I would love to hear from you. What are specific elements of setting that you struggle with? Because I certainly want to make sure we get that covered. All right. When it comes to setting, a lot of it has to do with strategy. Now, I know like a lot of you are not necessarily planners, you're more pantsers or maybe plantsers or something like that. But strategy, of course, is important because when it comes to anything artistic, you have to sort of know when you're finished. You have to have expectations and goals because otherwise, yeah, you can constantly ask this question: did I include enough setting? Did I not include enough setting? Etc. Etc. And as you're probably aware, different genres have different expectations for the settings. And so, if you're dealing with a fantasy book, you would expect a much richer setting, perhaps, than like a romance. But just because you're not in a genre that's maybe world famous for having, unusual settings or things like that, doesn't mean you should give your settings short shrift. As much as we love doing the kind of world building of these magical, mystical worlds that we could never see in real life, there's something to be said for unique worlds that could exist in real life. A quirky roadside stop or a old manor by the lake, or even just a retro diner, or perhaps maybe not so retro, maybe this is actually back in the past or things like that. And so setting, of course, no matter what genre you're writing, is important, right? Even beyond the ones where you might naturally come to mind, like fantasy and sci-fi. Now, I love my acronyms. I actually have two acronyms for you today, so it's like two for the price of one. So I certainly hope you're in store for that. The first one is craft. So we have C is for concept, R is for remarkable, A is for atmosphere, F is for fullness, and T is for texture. And again, one of the reasons why we want to approach setting like this is that strategy is to give us a sense of, when did we kind of get it done? Leonardo da Vinci says, no art, or I believe he's claimed to have said, no art is finished, only abandoned, right? And so when do you get it done? Well, if you have a nice little guideline like this craft guideline, you'll have a sense of that. So let's get into brass tacks. And I told you there'll be two acronyms. So I actually have an acronym for the concept itself, because world building is really a topic in of itself. And we'll do a little bit of a high level. Maybe we'll go a little bit deeper at another time if you'd like to see that. If you'd like to see it, please let us know, because we, of course, want to provide write shops and sessions like this on topics you're interested in. So let's imagine that you have a novel and it's set at a bowling alley. And you want the bowling alley to feel like an authentic place. You don't, it's a nice environment, but like you want to go a little bit beyond that. How would you world build it? Well, you would ask yourself some basic questions like maybe how long has the bowling alley been in the family? What is the financial situation of the bowling alley? What is the most vulnerable structure on the bowling alley, or what vulnerable element of it, right? What could be in jeopardy? What historical things have taken place? Why would somebody want the bowling alley to fail? What is funny about the bowling alley? All of these things make you ask questions about the environment beyond the confines of the story. Now, this could, of course, be done in advance while you're brainstorming your story or outlining it or whatever. But it also could be done after the fact. Maybe you've written your entire book and you know what the story is, that doesn't mean there isn't time now to go back and give a little bit more oomph to this setting. Because one of the things that makes a setting work is the sense that it exists outside the confines of your story. That this is just one story that took place there. It's what gives it an authenticity, right? And so just asking yourself some of these questions about sort of the history of the bowling alley, you get an idea of maybe little details you could throw in, right? Something that's vulnerable, maybe there's a pipe that keeps acting up, and that gives it something for the character to interact with. It's not going to completely change your story. It's not going to like steamroll everything, but it's just a little detail to give it a more authenticity and also reveal some character development. Why would the bowling alley want the bowling alley to fail? Maybe somebody wants the property for something, or maybe there's a rival company. And again, it doesn't have to take over your plot. It doesn't have to all of a sudden become some major subplot that they're worried that the bowling alley will fail or that the rival company does shady things or something. But just something as simple as them reacting to a deal that the other company is doing or undercutting them or something, again, could reveal some character development and could make it feel more authentic. And what is funny, I mean, that's just could be a nice little quirk. Maybe there's one machine that doesn't work well unless you like hit it or something like that. And again, that could be something you implement and characters interact with it. And then maybe a new character, kind of fish out of water or whatever, the new person on the block, eventually they learn, oh, yeah, that's how you fix it. And they kick it and it works. And then you realize, okay, they're part of the family now, right? And it's just a little way of incorporating that. Again, doesn't have to completely steamroll your plot. Now, on the other hand, sometimes when you do this, you'll actually think, you know what? I've got something here. Maybe it could be a sequel or a spinoff, or maybe you actually could flesh out your story a little bit more. Often we include too much in an outline or a first draft, but that's not always the case. Sometimes things maybe are a little bit too easy or too simple, and this is a good way to find kind of an organic way of exploding that a bit. All right, I did promise that second acronym. So when it comes to exploring your world building, I like to use the term area, and that stands for awesome, resources, entities, and axioms. All right, so when it comes to awesome, it's always best to veer on the side of awesome, right? I mean, we're supposed to be having fun. This is fiction, right? I mean, maybe you're writing nonfiction, but even then, you want to ask yourself, what is awesome about what I'm talking about? What is interesting? What is different? What's the hook? Right? That is where you get to some interesting factors. We'll talk a little bit more about uniqueness in a minute. What about the resources? What is abundant in your environment? What is scarce in the environment? This, of course, informs economy, it informs rules, it informs so many things. So it's helpful to know that. In a bowling alley, you could say some of the things that might be available could be, or not available could be windows, perhaps, because maybe the bowling alley just doesn't have a lot of bowling alleys I've been to don't have a whole lot of windows. So what does that mean? Maybe it means nothing, but maybe it does mean something. Maybe it's a place for them to hide out in a storm or something like that, right? But what keeps everything alive in that space, right? Well, again, in a bowling alley, you'd be like, well, the electricity, the water, is it ever under threat? Should it be? Should you end up in a situation where their power gets shut off, they don't pay a power bill, or there's a calamity or something, just to raise the temperature of a scene or to make things more interesting, right? So even a more mundane environment can be made better if you just ask these questions, right? These basic questions of what is going on in that world around them. And of course, you can, if you're thinking of like an entire new planet, it's helpful to think, at least in broad terms, how this works. I mean, you don't have to necessarily be Tolkien and spend decades coming up with your world building, but you should at least have some basic answers to these questions. And that brings us to the entities. All right, so we have a sense of like what's really cool about the place, what kind of makes it tick, what makes it function. And now we're going to ask ourselves what lives in that space. And again, in a bowling alley, okay, the obvious thing would be people who go there, but like what about, I don't know, roaches or rats if it's not very clean, a squirrel, does a cat live there because somebody has a pet? Ask yourself those questions, because again, that's a way to create some more interesting elements to your setting. And of course, if you're building a fantasy world or a sci-fi world, you really want to consider this in the pecking order and what consumes whom and how the different characters interact. One thing that happens a lot, I think, in world building that is not the best is people sort of have this episodic or very segmented view. It's like, this is the realm of the big spiders, and this is the realm of the giant turtles, and this is the realm of the mer people. And that's all well and good. It can be helpful for the audience to sort of just keep track of one thing at once. But on the other hand, what can be a lot more fun is the interaction of the elements, right? How do they intertwine with one another? And so rather than be quite so segmentized, think about how they actually cooperate, because sometimes you'll end up with interesting team ups. You would think these animals hate each other, but they work really well, like, clownfish and anemone, or the birds with the rhinos, and things like that, right? It feels very real when you do that, and also clever because you can have animals interact in a way that the audience doesn't expect. But yeah, just a simple question of what lives in that space can be helpful. Just kind of think about it, and I'm not saying it's like the microorganism, you can go overboard, right? But like, try to think about some of the different things that live there. And again, that can inform some other things to explore. Now, what about axioms? Statements of truth that people believe. And this is specifically in regards to the space. Now, this, of course, informs the entire worldview and a moral view. So, when you're doing world building, if you're thinking of a completely original world, you, of course, have to think of these things like, what does this society value? Do they value life? Do they value work? Do they value um, survival, or whatever it is, right? If you're basically setting in more or less normal world, but it's a little bit of a twist, what you want to ask yourself are, what are the specific axioms that live in this world? Never walk on the bowling alley with your basic shoes. You always walk with the bowling shoes, right? Uh, whatever, different things that might come into play. We never keep this door open. We never, because if we keep this door open, our AC bill goes up really high, or things like that. Again, it may not actually matter that much to your story, and I'm not saying shoehorn this in just to give your space some uh, texture. However, it could, right? It could just give you a little moment where the new character that doesn't know what they're doing props open the door, and then the dad comes over. He's like, you're going to kill our electric bill. And then they have kind of a bad way to start out. And it gives you a reason for them to get off on that bad footing that feels very natural and organic. And it tells you a lot in a short amount of time. It tells you this is a person who's very economically oriented. It tells you that they live in an area where air conditioning is very important. Perhaps it's very warm, or things like that, et cetera, et cetera. Certain things that could be axiom would be like priorities of species. This could happen. What if the person treats their cat like royalty, even though they live in this bowling alley, and people just kind of have to put up with it, and it's really awkward? Sure. Directional value. What do they ultimately stand for? Right? What is the purpose of this bowling alley? Obviously, they like to make money, but is that their ultimate value, or do they like making money by providing value? Which means their ultimate value is being purposeful, right? Giving people entertainment or something like that. And so maybe they wouldn't be quite so mercenary about their pricing structure or whatever, because that's not their ultimate value. How does this dictate behavior? Are they really strict about the rules within this space? You've all been to somebody's house and you feel like if you breathe the wrong way, they're gonna notice when they turn their head, and you have to like take your shoes off, and you have to step on that little platform and shake the dust off. I'm just kidding, but it could be like that sometimes, right? And you're like maybe on edge, or maybe that's you, and that's the way you live because that's what makes you comfortable, right? But again, that's interesting. What are some common and uncommon opinions about this space? I hate that couch. It is the ugliest couch I've ever seen, but my mom won't let me throw it away because it was my grandmother's old couch. Just little things like this, again, can make an environment feel more real and believable and interesting. And that's just like one sentence, right? I'm not saying that your setting has to completely steamroll you and, become a 5-page essay on the inner workings of whatever the design of the tile work or something. Not that that's always a bad thing. Well, 5 pages probably is a bit much, but I think sometimes we hold back because we're really worried about boring the audience. If you've seen any of my other presentations, one thing I always come back to is what is interest well, what do you need to include in your book? And it's whatever would make the current conflict most interesting. So common or uncommon opinions often create conflict, right? Especially the uncommon one, the hot take. That, paint color on the wall is horrible. I wish I could change it. Okay, that's conflict. They don't really like the environment. And why is it that way? Who painted it that way? Was it somebody that actually is in the family and they actually like it? So this is it. This is going to be fairly interesting to us, right? Versus, I really love this wall color. Isn't it great? That's a little bit harder to justify because it's like, well, I would assume that because why did you paint it that? Of course you like it, right? So keep that in mind. All right, and that gets us to remarkable. So we have our concept for our world, and so now we're moving to remarkable. We want it to be interesting and distinctive. Why create a book in an environment that resembles something we've seen before or doesn't have unique characteristics? Why not add your own special flavor and special touch? Instead of just a normal miniature golf course, why don't you make it a miniature golf course themed to Jane Austen novels? By the way, I really wish this golf course existed because it looks like a whole lot of fun. Um, as long as they don't make me like dive in the water like Colin Firth in the BBC Pride and Prejudice. But anyway, but yeah, exactly. You automatically have some fun just by twisting it a little bit to the left or to the right or things like that. It makes you can include little elements of the what makes it interesting, and we'll fill in the gaps and things like that. So what are some ways to do this? Maybe this doesn't come just naturally to you. Nothing wrong with that. So one thing you consider is mixing things that generally don't go well together. Example I can think of just off the top of my head. This is just a romantic comedy I enjoy is the movie Return to Me. It's got kind of a strange plot, but it's just the dialogue is charming and the characters are charming. And it's set in a Italian Irish restaurant because there were two families, one was Irish, one was Italian, and they made this restaurant. It's not like this crazy thing. It's cute, right? And it has like a neon sign with a shamrock, and then it says like Italian restaurant. It's got little details like that, and it's not a big part of the plot or anything, but it's just a nice little distinctive environment, right? What about an unexpected environment for the situation? So you could say, all right, I'm writing in this genre and they always do it this way. What's something different? Maybe you're writing, I keep going back to romance, not that this is the only genre I'm going to talk about, but just because when you think of a genre with maybe more basic environments, you might think of romance. But yeah, how many times have we seen a romance that take place like, somebody interning in a business or working on a farm or a bakery or things like that? What are maybe some environments you don't see as often? Scuba divers set in outer space. I mean, that was like that movie Passengers, right? It was a fairly straightforward plot in many ways, but the setting made it very interesting. Of course, the setting had a lot to do with the premise because the premise was they were supposed to be in hypersleep and then they woke up and all of that, and it created tension later on. But again, all of that comes about because they put it in an unexpected environment. So something to keep in mind. Weather or geography, right? This is a place that gets rain all the time, doesn't get rain very much, has a weird canyon, has a, lava, has whatever, right? These things can, of course, make a more distinctive environment, hot springs or whatever. Now, the one thing is you don't want to set up, it's sort of a Chekhov's gun, so to speak, if you're not careful. Now, when I say Chekhov's gun, just in case you're not familiar with that term, it's based on the playwright Anton Chekhov, who said, if you're putting a big gun on set, on your stage in the first act, the audience is going to expect something to happen to it later on. Because why in the world would you spend the money to put a big prop gun and hang it on a mantle, and have it prominently displayed if it's not going to serve a purpose in the story? And so people, when they look on the stage, they're like kind of trying to figure out what happens next, right? I always love doing that for like farces because there's like 20 doors and you're like, okay, how are they going to do that? Right. But, you're trying to imagine what will happen. And so if it doesn't happen, you're like, ugh. Now, what's great is when it's paid off well. So an example of that would be the movie Knives Out, which has this chair that's almost like Game of Thronesy with like all these knives, right? And it's utilized really, really well. It's utilized so well that you probably wouldn't see it coming in the way that it's utilized because it's set up in a bunch of different ways. That's a very tight script, by the way. If you're looking for a tight script to study, I recommend the movie Knives Out. Sequel, not as much, but the first one, yes. But anyway, I know I'm on a rabbit hole. But when it comes to setting, you have to be careful when you throw in something really interesting, like we only get hurricanes once a year. Well, what does that tell me? It's like, I bet there'll be a hurricane, I bet there's going to be a hurricane and it's going to matter, right? We're right in the middle of Tornado Alley. I would expect there's going to be a tornado. Otherwise, why are you setting this up? Or tornadoes have importance to the plot. Maybe there isn't a tornado in the plot, but you find out somebody is a victim of a tornado or a tornado affected something. Like you wouldn't expect somebody to just bring that up because, right? And so you do have to be careful when you throw in some of these unique elements that you do intertwine them somewhat in the story. But it's not impossible for you to kind of use it as a misdirection or it's there because it's pretty. There's a pretty mountain in it. Why? Because I want a pretty mountain in it. That can be okay. But generally, I would say if you have a pretty mountain, why don't you have them go up it? Why don't you have them, why isn't it symbolize something, right? Do something more with it. All right. Alternate history. This can be a fun thing to do. So it doesn't have to be quite on the dramatic level of, some of the things you've seen. It's like, what if this major event didn't happen or something like that. But what I mean is even subtle things like, this is the town that time forgot or things like that. And that gets to technology tweaks, right? What if we lived in a world that didn't have this? Now, again, this doesn't have to be a fantasy sci-fi thing. You'll notice often in fantasy, it's low-tech societies because there's not much different. This is Arthur C. Clarke, right? Not much different between technology and magic, right? I mean, I'm amazed with some of the things going on right now. Nowadays I can type a few things and the computer can come up with all kinds of crazy things, and it feels like magic. It's amazing. And so, when you live in a world, I'm talking on a magic mirror right now, right? To people all over the world. So why would I need a magic mirror? Who cares? I can just plug it into the wall. And so often fantasy books are in a low tech society for that reason. Now, sci-fi is often about human ethics and discovery. And so it's about pushing technology and it's about the furthest technology can go and even further than you think. And what would that mean and all of that, right? Now, what about everything else? Just because you're setting it in more or less the real world doesn't mean you can't have technology tweaks. How many times have we seen the movie or read the book where the city person ends up in the middle of nowhere and they're like, oh, my cell phone doesn't work. They're like, yeah, you don't get no signal around here, and then they have to learn to adjust with the technology adjustment, right? Or the horror movie, all of a sudden the cell phones don't work or they drop it or it gets destroyed, right? So consider that as well. Consider technology tweaks, the person who's just a Luddite or whatever. That can be important in the setting of your story. It can be important of the setting. Oh, by the way, when I say setting of the story, I'm not assuming that this is like one setting that everything takes place in. Obviously, you're generally going to have multiple settings, and some of these tricks and tips are ways to just create a little bit of flavor, a little bit of nuance, even in a short amount of time. A couple of sentences with a lot of specificity and the audience will fill in those gaps, but it'll feel more real. It'll feel better. It'll be more distinctive, all of those things. So I do recommend thinking about these elements every time you change your setting. However, of course, you might have some grandiose setting that you have to spend more time on because more things happen there and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. All right. So yeah, we want to be unique. So consider that. You want to be remarkable. All right, let's move on to atmosphere. Right. So now that we have a concept, now that we have a sense of that uniqueness, that specificity, now let's talk about how do we create the atmosphere? How do we make it feel? How do we write about it in a believable way? How do we, convey the audience and get them involved and things like that? Of course, if you think about genres, All different kinds of genres will use setting to evoke atmosphere. And there's something kind of classically gothic about this, where the building itself almost becomes a character and things like that. But it doesn't have to be restricted to creepy or spooky settings or mysterious situations. That can be even the case in a story where they just have strong sentimental attachment towards something or something like that. Now, when describing things like colors or description, one thing that can be helpful is using similes. And particularly, this kind of goes into what we were talking about last time, which, if you haven't seen it, deep point of view, so we covered last time, it feels natural to your point of view character. So, in other words, if this is something where the character's never been there before, if they compare the item's color to something within their familiar experiences, what this does is it tells us a couple of things. It tells us what the color of the location looked like, what the color of that item looked like, and things like that. But it also tells us what that character knows. And so it does multiple things at the same time. And this gets back to what I was talking about at the beginning in terms of, are you worried that, by talking about your setting, you're going to bore the audience? Well, when you're doing multiple things at the same time, it's not likely you are going to do that, because we're learning about the character. And I'm not saying the average person would necessarily identify that, but we certainly subconsciously can identify that, right? We can get a sense of, oh, now I know a little bit more about them, right? Or even their personality, right? If they start comparing it to the same color as the old moldy sandwiches under my armchair or something, well, that comes across like somebody who's a little bit dark, jaded, maybe complacent, depressed, things like that, right? Now, of course, whenever you get into similes, there's always the danger, speaking of colors, of going a little bit purple, right? Of course, purple prose is when you kind of flaunt your craft versus just say it outright, because it's based on when people were purple to show off. But there also is something to be said about being artistic, being expressive, being unique. And so it will vary from character to character. So as long as it's within the character's, natural framing, their natural point of view, to say that, to make that comparison, you're going to be all right. All right. So what about fullness? We want to make sure that we describe the location in a rich way so that the audience can experience it. And let's start there, because again, I think some of us get worried. We're like, oh no, like if I do that, I'm going to get into a laundry list and it's going to be boring and the whole plot is going to stop and everybody's going to close the book, because I've been there. I've read books like that. Okay, there's nothing wrong with going too far and then cutting back. In many ways, that can be better than not describing enough. When you don't describe your setting enough, you do rob the audience of a lot of things. Uh, One reason why, texting different people is so uh, stilted and unnatural is because we lose the context, right? Yes, we lose the context of things like in your tone and your body language and things like that, which are huge. But we even lose the context of like, where even is that person? How do they live? Things like that, right? If you go on to Instagram and you get an idea of how people live, you only get a certain sense of their context, right? You get the context that they want to show you, which often is more fanciful and put together than the way that their life really is. Well, that's not what books are trying to do. We don't want the Instagram version of your character. We want to feel them in real life, right? We want to know. So we want to see the seams. We want to see the cracks. And so you want to include things like that bookshelf that they wanted to fix and they just never got around to it, and that photograph of their friend that they dropped, and or whatever, that frame that dropped and it got cracked and they felt bad about it and they put it back up and they keep meaning to replace it and they haven't. Or all these things mean something, right? Because actions speak louder than words, and your environment says a lot about who you are, what you're willing to put up with, what you prioritize in life. So all of this can be tremendously interesting. It just has to be specific, right? And it has to, and I would say it has to mean something, but I don't want you to leave out something because you don't think it would naturally have meaning, because a lot of these things do have meaning. But you have to get really into it, right? You have to be willing to get into the level of detail that can reveal that meaning rather than fly at this high level. If you fly at a high level, yeah, it's going to be boring. If you're like, they had a couch and they had a lamp and they had a TV and they had, like, none of that tells me anything about that because that could be anybody, right? I mean, I guess not everybody has a TV and has a couch, sure, but it could be anybody. It doesn't sound very distinctive, right? And so distinctive details often are fine. And again, it's better to go too far and then take a step back. And then you can ask yourself, all right, what am I including here that actually adds meaning? Because the things that would add meaning in the surrounding would be things that tell you something about that person, not something that everybody has, right? Things that they would either should consider, should do, but aren't, or really value, not the things that are flying under that character's radar. That should fly under our radar too. Totally agree. But again, go rich and then back off. And how do we go rich? So you might be like, okay, I get it conceptually, but can you give me a roadmap? Yes, I can. So you want to consider a lot of different things. And let's just go down that laundry list and consider all the things that we could, in fact, talk about. So, what about the ground? That would be something that's very easily overlooked. Now, you might be like, the ground? Well, yes. What kind of footing is the character on? Right? There is a difference sometimes with this. If they're on hard floors, if they're on carpet, if they're on wobbly floors, if they're on creaky floors, if it's sticky because the people's spilling soda all the time, or because your dog is making a mess because they're not trained yet, or whatever, right? These are ways to create perhaps a little bit of detail, and again, it could be easily missed. It might be overlookable because, again, it might not be distinctive at all. Yeah, totally look over it. But ask yourself, is it distinctive? I guess that's a good kind of, now that I'm thinking about it, that's just a good thing to have in the back of your head, right? Is it distinctive? Let's put it on paper. If it's not, okay, we can skip it, right? So the ground. All right, what about the walls? And when I say walls, that could be all different kinds of things. Anything that's keeping them kind of in the space. So it could be the tree line. It could be the rock line. It could be, the line where the sky meets the sea, if you're Moana. Like what are the things that are holding you in place, right? Or the literal walls. Again, could be completely undistinctive or lacking distinction. I don't think undistinctive is a word. Indistinct, right? I can talk. But it could be like that, or it could be very interesting. Just don't overlook it. Okay, decor. And what I mean by that is purposeful items to display. This is often incredibly insightful. This tells you how that person thinks. What if they don't have anything on their walls? They're pretty minimalist, right? Or they're complacent, or they're lazy, or something. Bland, perhaps, right? What if they are just maximalist? They cover everything. It could be they're a little bit pretentious, or they just love abundance, or they're very vibrant, or things like that, right? Plants, so living things in the space, but not animals. So, things that are alive. There's this whole like feng shui concept, right, about having living things in the space. Yeah, just ask yourself, maybe there isn't anything distinctive, but again, it could be. What was it? I'm reminded of like it was the movie Juno, right, where her mother-in-law, no, her birth mother keeps giving her cacti, and she's like, yeah, this stings as much as your abandonment, right? And it's just a great way for her to say that because she gets these cacti, right? And it's kind of quirky and fun and anything, it's kind of interesting. Animals. Yeah, what about, okay, things that are alive that are animal life, creatures. Maybe they're pets, maybe they're just things that live in the space. It is important to think about that, right? Again, maybe it's not distinctive. It's a couple houseflies like some houses have, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's more interesting than that. And ask yourself, should it be more interesting than that? And one thing that is easily forgotten about is the lighting of a space. And again, it doesn't have to be artificial lighting. It could be how the sun is coming into the environment, whether or not it's bright or dark or things like that. Now, I'm not saying you have to be like a movie and you have to like think about how the characters are saying it, because otherwise people are going to think it's weird. By the way, one thing you'll notice in movies is they throw lights all over the place for like no reason. Now that I've told you this, you're going to notice it, but there's like lights everywhere and they're like, there's no reason they would have that many lights, but it's because it makes for an attractive image and things like that. Now, when it comes to a book, a lighting can do something like create conflict. They can't see very well. So they have an old flashlight, right? That's very interesting. When you can't see very well, that's a very intimidating place to be. We're limited sensor wise, right? So that's huge. On the other hand, a really really bright place can feel intimidating, accusatory. You know, it's like that bright light in your face when you're getting interrogated because it's off-putting or whatever. So yeah, that's something to think about as well. Now, I'm not saying every time you mention a room, you have to think of where the lamp is, but ask yourself where the light is coming from, because sometimes that can create some interesting conflict. Sometimes that has to do with, how shadows are getting cast on the wall, the technology level. It's a way to include a lot of different things as well, for sure. All right. Texture. So this would be, so where am I at? I'm at T. Oh yeah, this is the last one in my acronym, right? So texture, the different ways of actually describing it. So I've kind of gone through all the different things. I first talked about what are the things you need to consider, when making the concept in the first place. How do you make it distinctive, right? How do you begin to write about it? What are the details to include and things like that? And now we're going to talk about how to actually convey that further by, now that we have a sense of, okay, we want to talk about the fact that there's that old painting on the wall, or we want to talk about the carpet. What is the most effective way of doing that? So senses, of course, right? How does the actor, how does your protagonist interact with this world? So, we have the five senses. It's always best to consider as many of them as possible, because that can make a richer experience. Of course, sight and sound and touch, to a certain sense, get a lot of exposure in a book. You almost always think sight, sound, sight, sound, sight, sound, because those are predominant senses that we think about. However, smell is one of the strongest senses that people have. And if you think about it, how many times have you entered a space and the smell was off-putting or pleasant or things like that? Plenty of times. So it's something to consider. It also is a way to sort of backdoor your way into other description. The smell of whatever tells you that the whatever is in that space, right? The smell of uh, popcorn popping in the popper. I used to work in a movie theater. I should know these terms better. But yeah, that's a sentimental smell for me, because I worked in a movie theater for a while. And it's also a nice smell. There's a reason why they like pump it out and stuff. It smells nice, butter and salt and all that. So yeah, you enter it and you can get overwhelmed with that. And you're like, oh, it's the movies, right? It feels like home, or whatever it is. On the other hand, there is a musty smell of some indoor theme park attractions I like. I like indoor water theme park attractions. And of course, you put a lot of water inside. Even if you seal it up, even if you do all the things, I mean, it's water and it's inside and it's getting into things. And, who knows what's going on. Every so often they have to like tear it out because there's mold or whatever. It is what it is. I'm not criticizing the parks or anything. But then there ends up being this distinctive smell, especially in certain ones. And there's something about it, like there's one I haven't visited in a very long time, but right now I can think about it. I'm like, yeah, that's what it smells like. And I'm looking forward to going back and being like, it's that smell. And it's not even pleasant. It's not unpleasant. It's just distinctive. Right. But it's something I really, really remember. There's the old thing where they say, for creative types, to get it like a crayon and like scratch it a little bit and smell it, because like brings you back to your childhood, and it's supposed to like increase your creativity by some odd percentage. I don't know if that's actually like true, but that's like something people spread around. But it does make sense. It rings true, right? And again, something not to forget about. And taste, right? Taste is something that we can forget about, because you're like, well, they're not eating anything. But remember, things hit your mouth often in the same way they hit your nose. They're interconnected. So you can have the taste of the popcorn in your mouth, even if you're not eating it. It's how it hits you, right? The taste of the ocean and things like that. So it is something to consider and something to look at for sure. Now, beyond the five senses, there of course are other senses that we have as human beings, right? Like our sense of space. So this, of course, is something that could be used in locations all the time. It's so much bigger than I expected. Their living room is as big as my whole house, right? Their bathroom is the size of my tool closet. I don't know, but that sort of thing, of course, can be very, very helpful. Sense of balance. Again, when we get to the floor, instead of just talking about the floor, well, if it's a creaky floor, or whatever, if it's an uneven floor, they almost trip or they do trip or things like that. That can again be a great way to just raise the temperature of a scene, right? Make it a little off kilter. Needs some repair or some of the bricks are loose or something like that. Sure. Sense of pain. Now, locations, of course, can give you pain for various reasons. Maybe it's a very steep incline, and so you have to like trudge up there and you're in terrible pain about it. Again, that would be a way to talk about it, right? Their driveway was horrible. I felt like there was an elephant on my back. It was so steep or something. Sure. And you could say, well, why would you even need to include that? Well, what happens next? Now that character is in a much more tense, stressed out place. You've sort of symbolically set up the fact that this location is up higher, and so they're having to struggle to even get there. There's a reason to do that, right? And so consider that. Consider if the environment could be inflicting pain in some way. It's so cold, it hurts. It's so hot. We're going to talk about temperature in a minute anyway. The chair is super uncomfortable, right? It's just a way to escalate tension, get the character in a different headspace, make the environment oppressive. All of the things could be really, really helpful. What about body needs? These are things that we think about. So yeah, it's like the old joke whenever an elevator stops, everyone's like, all right, we got to designate a pee corner, right? Because you want to immediately think of your basic needs. Sometimes when you think of a space, you don't think of this. Like, well, where do they actually go to the restroom? Where do they find privacy to engage in procreation or whatever it is they need to do, right? Um, this could be important, and it could be that this is something somebody notices. They're like, oh, where do you go to the restroom, right? Or how do you handle this, or things like that. Yeah, I mean, and maybe it's not important, right? Because again, if it's something they don't even think about, certain societies have different ways of handling this, and it's not something they specifically think about, then they don't necessarily have to mention it. But certainly if you have a fish out of water, yeah, it's something perhaps to consider for sure. I remember in Harry Potter, one of the ways that the room of requirement is mentioned is because Dumbledore talks about really having to use the restroom, and the room of requirement created a room of chamber pots for him. And it's a fun little humorous moment that's just a little aside. I believe she talks about it like in the third book, and then it comes up in the fifth book, or maybe it's the second book. I don't remember, but it's foreshadowing, right? She brings it up, and you're like, oh, that's kind of funny. Hogwarts is a weird place, and then it turns out no, it's actually a room that like does what you need it to do. Isn't that interesting, right? But again, it feels very natural because it's like, yeah, you have to go to the bathroom sometime. Isn't that interesting, right? So we don't think about it. Yeah, temperature. That's a great way of making things oppressive or not, right? It's so hot. I can't even think. It's so cold. I'm going to die, whatever. One of the things about temperature is it is a statement about your own livelihood or your own life force, because if it's too hot, yeah, eventually it can get so hot it will kill you. If it's too cold, yes, eventually you get too cold, it'll kill you. Now, most of the time you don't have characters that are necessarily in life-threatening situations, but the point is that you're starting to turn the dial that direction, right? If you're in a really cold room and you don't have a jacket and you're shivering, that is your body like fighting for life in a mild way. So it does really matter, and it can make a huge difference to the characters in that scene. And again, it's a great way to just turn up the temperature a little bit. Speaking of temperature, raise the stakes. Another thing too, of course, is it can create situations where everybody has to like huddle around a campfire or something like that, huddle around a heater, right? And the environment feels natural, believable, and now we're pushing the characters into things, and it can create some natural ways to force things, the classic like forced proximity romance sort of scenarios, things like that. What about a sense of time? We have actual locations sometimes in books where time doesn't work the same way, like Narnia or things like that, or the movie Interstellar played with that. The gravitational pull actually changed at the time. These are very interesting. I thought the way Interstellar used time in the setting was very clever. I mean, I hadn't seen that much. And you have that really powerful moment when he comes back from the planet and decades have passed and he has to see his kid grow up and it's very sad and all of that. That all came about because of the way that the setting played with time. Now, maybe you're not doing something nearly that dramatic. You're not working in fantasy or sci-fi. I get it. But does time seem to stand still here? Is this a place that you hate? And it's like, I can't wait to get out of it. And it just seems like it takes forever. I go over to my whatever relative's house and it's like, oh, I can't wait to get out of here. Well, how does that affect how they view the setting? What about the setting? Sometimes you even want to kind of lean into that with the setting, and so things can be slow in the setting, and there's a drip 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 of something, and just to really put your stamp on it, there's a really loud ticking clock and they're like, oh, it'll just never end, right? Sometimes that can be a helpful way to put a big put a button on that concept. But yeah, I mean, also there's places that you love and you're like, I never want to leave. And it's so sad I have to leave and things like that. And again, what you might want to do is a little bit of franticness, right? Energy, excitement in the description. And then it's like, oh, I feel it. I feel like there's so much going on and it's so colorful and everything. And I wish that they didn't have to leave this wonderful, magical place or whatever it is. Sure. All right. So yeah, there are around 20 to 30 senses. Yeah, there are a lot. Those are some of the bigger ones that I mentioned there. You could go on and on about it. And of course, you could go on and on about this topic. But when it comes to topics like this, like we did with, the deep point of view, one thing I find that's super helpful is to actually write about it. I know, shocking, right? But it's, the proof is in the eating, as it were, actually going and doing the work. And so we have developed some write shops with interactive assignments where you can actually hone in on these different things. And so rather than me just talk about it in kind of an abstract way, we will do challenges and little exercises, and you can practice and you can get live feedback from me. Let me show you a little bit more about that here. Just a second here. And yes, if you have any, before I leave, if you have any questions about whatever I covered, I'd love to open it up for questions at this time. All right, let's get going.
For centuries, humankind has learned writing the only way they knew how. Boring, stoic, dry presentations. Shouldn't writing be fun?
Presenting Write Shops! Imagine this, you're crafting a scene from the perspective of your talking cat, getting instant feedback on your dialogue and laughing along with fellow writers as you brainstorm ridiculous plot twists. That's Write Shops! Traditional writing lessons are like watching paint dry, slowly. Write Shops are more like a paintball fight. Our dynamic, interactive assignments challenge you to think creatively and push your boundaries. You'll get feedback on everything from plot development to character to voice to style, the kind of feedback that helps you see real improvement fast. We can't guarantee you'll win a Pulitzer, but we can guarantee a product that you'll be proud to show your grandma. And that's what really counts, isn't it? Ready to ditch the endless lectures and unleash your inner storyteller? Start writing something amazing. Start your Write Shop today and reach new creative heights. I'll see you there.
All right. So yeah, we have some upcoming for this topic, and I guarantee I will be there in my safari outfit. No, Sunday at 3 p.m. and Tuesday at 7 p.m. That is Eastern Standard Time. So, and if you would love to go and you're like, these times don't work for me, let us know, because we might be able to actually adjust some of this for you, particularly if we get a few people that agree with you, because yeah, our goal is, of course, to create environments and settings and times that are good for everybody here. All right, so I have some questions here. I'm gonna try to explore them myself. Hold on. All right. Let me adjust myself a little bit. Okay. In a short story of, say, 20,000 words or less, okay, so it's pretty long for a short, getting closer to a novella, but yeah, it's not a full length novel. How can you create great setting with limited words? Can you give an example by coming up with the scene of an office space that belongs to a vampire? I love the specificity, Gina, and that's exactly what you're looking for, right? You're looking for that kind of fun and definitely have the remarkable going on there. Um, I'm not going to necessarily give you something right off the top of my head because I want you to write it. But what I would say is anytime you're describing, let's go a little bit more granular than the entire office space. I'm assuming the entire work takes place in this office space, or at least a lot of it does. And maybe it doesn't. But what I would say is pick the room you're talking about and think of 3 things to get in really close detail about. Because what will happen if you do that is it'll start to kind of fill in the gaps of everything else. And that's 3 sentences, maybe 30, 40 words. And you do so much for yourself that way. What I mean by that is get very specific. So it's like that ugly armchair with textiles from the 1970s that practically is falling over, but unless you sit in it just the right way or something. That's what I mean by a distinctive element there, right? So do that, and you'll go far, right? If you have 3 of those, that's a good starting place. And you may not even need to do much more than that in order to establish that sort of thing. The other thing to think about is beyond those sort of, you could just call painting a picture statements, consider, how the characters are interacting with the environment, right? And as I said in the deep point of view, and I'll continue to say, people tend to notice the environment when it's showing a conflict for them or when it is helpful to them, right? And so imagine something that's not going right for that character, and then they will interact with it, and it'll cause even more trouble for them. It's the elevator that gets stuck in the office place. It's the flickering lighting that drives them bananas and gives them a migraine. I don't know what it is, but when you start talking about that, then it's affecting the story. It's not really taking up much time. I mean, when you think of something as big as what you're talking about, you have a fair amount of wiggle room to play with, right? Because I think what happens is we're like, well, I can't talk about the setting because it's going to slow everything else down. It doesn't have to, as long as it's doing multiple things. If it's telling you about the character's state of mind, if it's telling you, if it's informing the plot in terms of things and stuff like that, yeah, sure. When doing historical locations in fiction/fantasy, how deep should we be going into research? Ooh, I love this question. I'm getting hung up on it, and it's stifling my actual writing and creativity. Is there a more balanced approach to? Yes. Perhaps. I guess it depends on where you're at, but often the answer is yes. So when it comes to research, here's my general rule of thumb. Is I do think it's important to give yourself an arbitrary deadline. What I mean by arbitrary, it means that it will vary from person to person. Somebody who writes a police procedural and they have to really be careful because the audience is going to like stick them on every detail, or hard sci-fi or something. That's very different. Now, if you're writing sci-fi fantasy that's more speculative, then the audience isn't expecting that level of detail. So it's more of, I want to make sure I put enough into it that I've kind of thought it out. I'm not going to have any major plot holes. I'm going to exploit it the best. And for that, I think you can give yourself a time frame. And that's going to be somewhat dependent on your production schedule. How much do you actually want to get done in a time frame to feel accomplished as an author, which is somewhat self-inflicted, right? Because some people are very happy. It's like, oh, I release 1 book a year. Fantastic. Other people are like, no. I've got to release 1 every other month. I've got to stay ahead of the title. I've got to stay away with the algorithm. So that's going to be dependent on you. But I do recommend having that so you can look yourself in the mirror and be like, yes, I did that, right? I did my diligence. Now, here's the thing. One reason why you want to keep going and going and going is because you're like, well, if I just keep going, I'll keep myself from making a mistake or doing something big or what. I mean, probably not, because we've all been there and seen artists get challenged. I mean, J.K. Rowling was asked how many kids are in Hogwarts, and she gave a ridiculous answer that made no mathematical sense. So obviously, it just wasn't in the back of her head of like, oh, there's whatever 3,000 students. I don't remember what the actual number seems to be based on what people say, but she didn't have that in the back of her head. And so she gave an answer that made absolutely no sense, and people called her out on that. In the meantime, her worlds are so well regarded that, Universal, I like theme parks. I'm going to think about that. Universal theme parks have now built 3 successful areas based on her IP, right? So she certainly knows what she's doing to a certain extent, right? You certainly can't say that she's complete, nincompoop when it comes to world building, right? But yet she couldn't answer such a basic question as just how many people are even there. So my point is that you can't just stress out about answering all those questions. What I generally recommend is the sort of research at that high level, like I was talking about earlier with the area format, right? What's awesome about your world? You really want to narrow down what's awesome about your world, because that's what people are going to remember. People are going to think about how many students are at Hogwarts. They're going to think about things like the paintings talk and the stairs move and the awesome parts of it, right? And then you want to think of like what is scarce and what is plentiful, because that could create a plot hole. If you're like, well, they easily have access to this or they don't easily have access to that, well, stay to that, right? So yeah, you definitely want to do that. You want to think about what lives there and how they interact with each other, because you can leave free money on the ground. You cannot think of, oh, this interacts with this and that would be a really compelling scene, or this eats this. And so that could be, you want to think about that. And then the last one you want to think about is, okay, therefore, how do people respond? How do they create culture and rules around the space and things like that? Because that really can end up in world building issues. Again, I'm going to J.K. Rowling. There's the rule of you can't apparate into Hogwarts. You can't just magically put yourself in there. There's all these different spells. And so when people sneak in, it's a big plot point, because it's like, how did they get in? There's all this protection and all of that. And so again, that's they made those rules because people in that world have the ability to go wherever they want. And so it's like, well, if people just had the ability to just like break into your house, what would you do? And it's like, well, I'm sure there would be some sort of counter spell to keep them from doing that, right? And so you'd want to think about that. Think of the implications of what people can do and what entities can do and things like that. And so very, very high level. That's not the same thing as the full life cycle of every animal, the full life cycle of every plant, more in the abstract, because that's where it'll get you. It'll get you because people be like, well, wait a minute, you've established it never rains, and how do they have water in this scene, and things like that. That's where it gets you more than the nitty gritty. Anyway. I see, Lori, you're asking specifically about plotter in terms of tracking setting in a novel. I think that is a great question. And I think that that could be its own a video. So stay tuned for that, and I'll look into that. And I will see what I can do about that. Kind of like a tutorial of that. I think that sounds really cool. And certainly if you come to the right shop, I'll have some more for you on that. Thank you. You like the shirt? Yeah, I actually designed this shirt. I created it. So I didn't sew it, but yeah, I worked on the graphics of it. Anyway. So thank you very much for joining me. As we were saying, if you would like to give us feedback about what you would like to see in the future for these live sessions or for the Right Shops, please, please, please let me know and let us know, because we certainly want this to get better and better, and we want to have things that you would like. Oh, I didn't give the link here. For the Right Shop, if you want to join us, you can join us at plotter.com/academy. And that would be where you can find out information about them. And I would love to see you there. for sure. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure. It's only because of all of you I can do what I love, which is help artists and talk about writing. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I will see you all later. All right. Bye, everybody.